During the 1960s, the Latino population of the United States grew from 3 million to more than 9 million. Today, the Latino population includes people from several different areas, primarily Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Central America, and South America. Wherever they settled during the 1960s, many Latinos encountered ethnic prejudice and discrimination in jobs and housing. Most lived in segregated barrios or Spanish-speaking neighborhoods. The Latino jobless rate was nearly 50% higher than that of whites, as was the percentage of Latinos living in poverty. As the presence of Latinos in the U.S. grew, so did their demand for greater representation and better treatment. During the 1960s, they demanded equal opportunity and respect for their culture and heritage. Thousands of Latinos worked on California's fruit and vegetable farms, performing backbreaking labor for little pay and few benefits. Cesar Chavez believed that farm workers had to unionize, that their strength would come from bargaining as a group. In 1962, Chavez formed the National Farm Workers Association. 4 years later, this group merged with a Filipino agricultural union to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC. Chavez and his fellow organizers insisted that California's large fruit and vegetable companies recognize the union as the bargaining agent for the farm workers. In 1965, California's grape growers refused to recognize the UFWOC. Chavez and the union sent farm workers across the country to convince supermarkets and shoppers not to buy California grapes in a movement that became known as La Huelga, or the strike. In 1970, the 5-year strike and boycott eventually paid off. The UFWOC finally gained better wages and benefits for workers from the grape growers. The success of the California farm workers led to increased cultural pride of Latinos across the country. Latinos also began organizing politically during the 1960s. Most worked within the two-party system. 8 Hispanic Americans served in the House of Representatives during the 1960s, and 1 Hispanic American was elected to the Senate. Other Latinos sought to create an independent Latino political movement. In 1970, La Raza Oneida, Mexican Americans United, was formed, running candidates in 5 states and winning races for mayor and positions on school boards and city councils. As are Latinos, Native Americans are a large group of diverse peoples, often viewed as a single homogeneous group. The many Native American tribes in the U.S. had shared one thing: a mostly bleak existence in the U.S. and a lack of autonomy or the ability to control their own affairs. Despite their cultural diversity, Native Americans as a group have been the poorest of Americans and have suffered from the highest unemployment rate. Attempts to merge Native Americans from reservations to mainstream American life during Eisenhower's administration failed miserably. In 1961, representatives from 61 Native American groups met in Chicago and drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose, which stressed the determination of Native Americans to choose their own way of life. The Declaration called for new policies designed to create economic opportunities for Native Americans on their reservations. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson established the National Council on Indian Opportunity to ensure that programs reflect the needs and desires of the Indian people. Many young Native Americans were dissatisfied with the slow pace of these reforms, however. Their discontent fueled the growth of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, A-I-M, a militant Native American rights organization. For some, the new activism of AIM meant demanding that Native American lands, burial grounds, and fishing and timber rights be restored. Others wanted a new respect for their culture. This sometimes led to violent confrontations with the government. In 1972, AIM leaders organized the Trail of Broken Treaties, a march on Washington, D.C. to protest the U.S. government's treaty violations against Native Americans throughout history. The marchers sought the restoration of 110 million acres of land and pushed for the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which many believed was corrupt. The marchers temporarily occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, where they destroyed records and caused $2 million in property damage. In 1973, AIM led nearly 200 Sioux to the tiny village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where the U.S. cavalry had massacred a Sioux village in 1890. In protest against both tribal leadership and federal policies, the Sioux seized the town, taking hostages. After tense negotiations with the FBI and a shootout that left 2 Native Americans dead and others wounded, the confrontation ended with a government promise to re-examine Native American treaty rights. Congress and the federal courts did make some reforms on behalf of Native Americans. For example, in 1972, Congress passed the Indian Education Act, and in 1975, they passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Both laws gave tribes greater control over their own affairs and over their children's education, and some groups went to federal court and eventually regained some of their rights to their ancestral lands. Women were also fighting for equality during this period of time. In the 1950s, Betty Friedan seemed to be living the American dream. She had a loving husband, healthy children, and a house in the suburbs. According to the experts, that was all that a woman needed to be happy. But Friedan was not happy. After conducting a survey of her female college classmates, she discovered that the majority of them were unhappy with their dream lives as well. Friedan eventually wrote and published The Feminine Mystique, a book in which she addressed the growing dissatisfaction among women. Inspired in part by Friedan's book, women in increasing numbers joined the nation's African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans in the fight for greater civil rights and equality in society. The theory behind the women's movement of the 1960s was feminism, the belief that women should have economic, political, and social equality with men. The women's movement gained strength with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender, and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, to handle discrimination claims. By 1966, some women argued that the EEOC didn't adequately address women's issues. 28 women, including Betty Friedan, created the National Organization for Women, or NOW, to pursue women's goals. By 1969, NOW's membership swelled to 175,000, and its members pushed for child care facilities that would enable mothers to pursue jobs and education, as well as for legislation that would end gender-based discrimination in hiring practices. Gloria Steinem, a journalist and political activist, also joined the struggle for women's equality at this time. In 1971, Steinem helped found the National Women's Political Caucus, a moderate group which encouraged women to seek political office. One of the more controversial positions that NOW and other feminist groups supported was a woman's right to have an abortion. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade that women do have the right to choose an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy. Some thought the ruling might bring an end to the emotional and divisive public argument. However, Americans still hotly debate this issue today. In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. At first, this seemed to be another victory for the women's rights movement. But the amendment needed ratification by 38 states in order to become part of the Constitution. The amendment scared many people, and a Stop ERA campaign was launched in 1972. Conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly, along with conservative religious groups, political organizations, and many anti-feminists, felt that the ERA would lead to a parade of horribles, such as the drafting of women, the end of laws protecting homemakers, the end of a husband's responsibility to provide for his family, and same-sex marriages. In order to combat the ERA and the pro-abortion supporters, conservatives in 1970 built what they called a new pro-family movement. This coalition focused on social, cultural, and moral problems and came to be known as the New Right. The New Right would later play a key role in the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. By 1977, the ERA had won approval in 35 of the needed 38 states, but the New Right gained strength, and by the deadline for ratification, the ERA could not muster enough votes in the remaining 3 states that it needed to become law. Despite the defeat of the NRA, the women's movement altered society in countless ways and transformed the role of women in American society and changed their attitudes towards education, career, and family. Meanwhile, on the political front, Richard Milhous Nixon entered office in 1969 and determined to turn America into a more conservative direction. He tried to instill a sense of order in a nation still divided over the continuing Vietnam War. One of the main items on Nixon's agenda was to decrease the size and influence of the federal government. Nixon's plan, known as New Federalism, was to distribute a portion of the federal power to state and local governments by giving more financial freedom to local governments. Under Nixon's revenue sharing plan, state and local governments could spend their federal dollars however they saw fit within certain limitations. In 1972, the revenue sharing bill known as the State and Local Fiscal Assistance Act became law. One of the more pressing issues facing Nixon was a troubled economy. Between 1967 and 1973, the U.S. faced high inflation and high unemployment, a situation economists called stagflation. Causes of stagflation included high inflation, a result of Lyndon Johnson's policy to fund both the Vietnam War and social programs through deficit spending at the same time, an increased competition for international trade, a flood of new workers, including women and baby boomers, and also a heavy dependency on foreign oil. The U.S. purchased most of its oil from OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC gradually raised prices in the 1960s, and then further increases resulted from the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the U.S. supported Israel against other Arab states. Nixon took several steps to battle stagflation, and while inflation eased for a short period of time, the economic recession continued. Nixon admittedly preferred world affairs and foreign policy to domestic policy. Throughout his presidency, Nixon's top priority was to gain an honorable peace in Vietnam. He also made significant advances in America's relationships with China and the Soviet Union. The architect of Nixon's foreign policy was his advisor for national security affairs, Henry Kissinger, who would later become Nixon's Secretary of State. Kissinger promoted a philosophy known as realpolitik, from a German term meaning political realism. Foreign policy should be based solely on consideration of power and not ideals or moral principles. In other words, if a country was weak, Kissinger argued, it was often more practical to ignore that country even if it was communist. Nixon and Kissinger adopted a more flexible policy for dealing with communist nations. This policy was called détente, a policy aimed at easing Cold War tensions. One of the most startling examples of détente came in early February 1972 when Nixon, who had risen in politics as a strong anti-communist, visited communist China. Nixon's visit to China was an attempt to take advantage of a decade-long rift between China and the Soviet Union. The two communist superpowers had broken off relations in 1960. Nixon's visit to China was not only a huge success in terms of international politics, it was also a huge success with the American public. 3 months after visiting Beijing, Nixon became the first U.S. president ever to visit the Soviet Union in May 1972. Like his trip to China, Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union was widely acclaimed. After a series of meetings called the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, or SALT, Nixon and Soviet Premier Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty, a 5-year agreement that limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, to earlier levels. Despite foreign policy successes, peace in Vietnam eluded Nixon. His administration grappled with the war for 6 more months after the Moscow trip, before finally withdrawing troops and ending America's involvement in Vietnam. By that time, another issue was about to dominate the Nixon administration, one that eventually led to the downfall of the president. The Watergate scandal centered on the Nixon administration's attempt to cover up a burglary of the Democratic National Committee, or DNC, headquarters at the Watergate office and apartment complex in Washington, D.C. By the time Nixon became president, the executive branch had taken on an air of imperial or supreme authority. For example, Nixon ordered troops to Cambodia without congressional approval. Nixon confided in a small and fiercely loyal group of advisors, men that became known as the Plumbers. These men had played a key role in Nixon's election and now helped him direct White House policy. Throughout his career, Nixon had lived with an overwhelming fear of losing elections. By the end of 1972, his campaign team sought advantages over Democrats by any means necessary, including an attempt to steal campaign information from the DNC headquarters in the Watergate complex. On July 17, 1972, at 2:30 a.m., a guard catches 5 men breaking into the headquarters of the DNC in the Watergate complex. The burglars planned to photograph documents outlining Democratic campaign strategy and to place wiretaps or bugs in the office. It was soon discovered that this group had ties to President Nixon. Throughout 1972 and 1973, the Nixon administration scrambled to cover up its involvement in the Watergate affair. In May 1973, the Senate began its own investigation of Watergate. It soon became apparent that Nixon was deeply involved in the affair. The Senate moved to subpoena tapes that Nixon kept of all of his conversations. The battle to get these tapes would last 1 year. In July of 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that Nixon must surrender the tapes. They refuted Nixon's argument that doing so would violate national security. The tapes proved that Nixon not only knew about, but also directed the cover-up of the break-in. On August 8, 1974, before the House of Representatives could vote on impeachment charges, Nixon resigned from office, but admitted no guilt. Gerald Ford, Nixon's vice president, was sworn in as the 38th president of the United States. The effects of Watergate were far-reaching. 25 members of the Nixon administration were convicted and served prison terms for crimes connected to Watergate. Watergate, along with Vietnam, produced a deep disillusionment with the office of the president among many Americans. The American public and media developed a general cynicism about public officials that still exists to this day. Upon taking office, Gerald Ford urged the American people to put the Watergate scandal behind them. Our long national nightmare is over, he declared. But the nation's nightmarish economy persisted, and Ford's policies offered little relief. On September 8, 1974, Ford pardoned Richard Nixon in an attempt to move the country beyond Watergate, but the move cost Ford a good deal of public support. Ford's actions to improve the economy had the opposite effect. The nation entered the worst economic recession it had seen in 40 years. Ford fared slightly better in the international arena. He relied heavily on Kissinger, who remained Secretary of State after Nixon's resignation. Ford pushed ahead with Nixon's policy on negotiation with China and the Soviet Union. In 1975, Ford signed the Helsinki Accords, a document signed by 35 nations promising greater cooperation between the nations of Eastern and Western Europe. This was probably Ford's greatest accomplishment as president. Ford also had to watch helplessly as South Vietnam surrendered to the Communist North in 1975. Ford asked Congress for $722 million to help South Vietnam, but Congress refused, and the South fell to the Communist North. Ford won the 1976 Republican nomination for president after fending off a powerful conservative challenge from former California Governor Ronald Reagan. The Democratic nominee was a nationally unknown peanut farmer and former governor of Georgia named Jimmy Carter. Carter promised to restore integrity to the nation's highest office. He and Ford squared off over the key issues of inflation, energy, and unemployment. Carter won the election by a narrow margin, 40.8 million popular votes to Ford's 39.1 million. Once in office, Carter failed to reach out to Congress and refused to play the insider game of deal-making. As a result, both parties on Capitol Hill often joined to sink Carter's budget proposals, as well as his major policy reforms on the welfare and tax programs. Carter focused much of his attention on battling the country's energy and economic crises, but was unable to bring the U.S. out of its economic slump. In the summer of 1979, renewed violence in the Middle East produced a major fuel shortage in the United States. Inflation skyrocketed from 7.6% to 11.3%. By 1980, inflation had risen to 14%. The U.S. standard of living slipped from first place to fifth place in the world, and Carter's popularity slipped with it. Carter also rejected the philosophy of realpolitik and adopted a foreign policy committed to human rights. Under Carter, the United States signed treaties with Panama, in which it relinquished control of the Panama Canal on December 31, 1999. Carter took this step in an attempt to improve U.S. relations with Latin America. Congress and public opinion were divided. The treaty passed by one vote more than the two-thirds required. Carter's firm insistence on human rights also brought an end to détente and a breakdown in relations with the Soviet Union over the Soviet Union's treatment of dissidents or those who opposed Soviet political policies. Carter and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT II agreement in June 1979, but the treaty met opposition in Congress, which felt that the treaty left the U.S. at a military disadvantage. Then, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion angered Carter, who refused to fight for the SALT II treaty in Congress, and the treaty died. Carter's greatest crisis occurred in January 1979 when revolution broke out in Iran, deposing the U.S.-supported Shah of Iran. The Muslim religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini led the rebels in overthrowing the Shah and establishing a religious state based on strict obedience to the Quran. Carter continued to support the Shah, allowing him to enter the U.S. for cancer treatment in October 1979. This act infuriated the revolutionaries in Iran. On November 4, 1979, armed Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. The militants demanded that the U.S. send the Shah back to Iran in return for the release of the American hostages. Carter refused, and a painful year-long standoff followed in which the U.S. continued quiet but intense efforts to free these hostages. The hostages would not be released until January 20, 1981, Inauguration Day, shortly after new President Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. Despite the hostages' release after 444 days of captivity, the crisis in Iran seemed to underscore the limits that America faced in the 1970s.